Good morning. Welcome to the Adult Faith Formation at Mount View Church in Park Hill, because that's where we are. And we welcome those who are listening online. And today I'm going to have Dr. Marjorie Lewis, who just got back from Rwanda. She's a member of Mount View Church, to come and introduce Dr. Shanti.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back home in a way. It's my task to introduce our presenter for today, who is Dr. Shanti Zaid, a scholar at the Blair Caldwell African American Research Library, and he will explain how religion developed in the African diaspora with a specific focus on Cuba. Dr. Zaid's work is focused on African American history and the broader African diaspora. He holds dual PhDs in African and African American Studies and Cultural Anthropology from Michigan State University. So, as I've told you, we're looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you all.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome in. It's a pleasure to be here to speak with you a little bit today. I want to talk a little bit today about religion in the African diaspora, which is religious traditions that were produced among African descendants, not just in the United States, but throughout the Americas and in other parts of the world, places that African people have moved to. And focus on religious traditions that emerged in Cuba, which is where I've done most of my work. I have a background with some degrees in history, in Africana studies, and in anthropology, and worked for many years as a part of the African Atlantic research team, traveling to Cuba and other sites in the Caribbean, trying to study the religious traditions there to get a better understanding of how they produced traditions, how they produced an orientation that made sense to their lives. And over the course of the work with the African Atlantic research team, I eventually honed a research project that explored multiple religious belonging in Cuba, which is kind of a foreign concept to us. The idea of practicing more than one religion seems kind of strange, but it was something I was seeing meeting with these different people, and so that's what I decided to study. But today we're going to focus on just some general characteristics of what religious traditions in the Caribbean and in the diaspora can look like. I want to share a few concept definitions just to get us on the same page. These concepts help us understand a little bit more about the foundation from which culture and religion can emerge that's not so conditional to our experiences here. So if we think of culture, I think we often think of culture as like some kind of difference out there, some people from another place that grew up in a different way, and maybe bring pieces of that here. But I want to encourage us to think about culture as something that concerns socially produced norms, values, behaviors, institutions of a group that shares both space and time. So the things that people are producing, sharing space and time, several generations and some kind of geographic proximity, you're going to work things out and things become normal. You create things that will help your ideas last. And that's how I want us to think about culture, as it applies to African diaspora. So in this sense, culture is not like a thing that's there that has certain characteristics and properties, but is a process that's ongoing, right? And then it's also not a passive process in that it's just something we inherit or something that's just there, but it is something that's actively being created and produced and reproduced and shared all the time, right? And without that work to do the work, there is no culture, right? So it is a very active process. All right, and then for religion, we tend to think about religion in terms of bodies of ideas, often that are clarified through some kind of text, some kind of book, and some kind of doctrines that clarify what the beliefs are and distinguish it maybe from other beliefs. But for religious practice in the African diaspora, it pushes us to think more broadly about what religion is. And so thinking about religion as something that concerns the knowledge and the practices of a group that orient them within issues of ultimate significance, right? And so in this sense, we are not looking to kind of belief characteristics that are clarified in a book, but as the body of ideas, the body of wisdom, the body of knowledge that people find relevant enough to pass on one generation to the next, to create traditions around strengthening these ideas that provide an orientation, right? A sense of direction in the world, being in the universe, right? What are those ideas that they're coming up with? And then finally, diaspora as this concept that refers to a scattering of people to different lands, right? Diaspora comes from the Greek dia, meaning across, and spora, meaning to sow or scatter. So it's kind of a sowing or scattering of seeds across distance, and then the maturation of those seeds in new locations, right? So it has this kind of agricultural metaphor for how culture and spirituality can develop and evolve in new places that are different from places that they had been previously. Within the African diaspora, there are some core characteristics that are widely shared among African descendants all across the world for these communities. One characteristic is a forced dispersion from a homeland. All right, so this is distinguishing it from just the idea of migration or a kind of choice that someone makes to resettle somewhere and have another life there. There is some kind of a forced push out of a homeland. That forced push can be something for a lot of African descendants in the Americas with the transatlantic slave trade. That was a forced capturing of people, transporting them and situating them in brand new locations, right? But it also can entail places that have had their countries, their cities, their towns devastated by colonialism or some similar kind of circumstances that also forces them out. They no longer have a home to remain in. Another characteristic of African diaspora is an identity that's tied to a real or mythical homeland. So when we think of people looking back to Africa, some people may have memories of the continent or of the particular places they were from that are very specific, but then over time, those memories, those ideas start to fade, start to transition into stories told about a place, about a homeland. And so it can take on a more of a mythical character. But the idea of a homeland and the relationship there is pretty strong. So that relationship is there, and then finally, the diaspora communities throughout the Americas in particular, and often throughout the world, are also characterized by systems of oppression and inequality that are organized to make things very difficult for African descendants. And it's not just a thing of the United States. We may be a little more familiar with here, but this is a characteristic that is shared across the Americas. And so with those kind of conditions, we think about how do religions emerge in that. With African diaspora religions, they can occupy kind of an unusual space in our thinking because they're not necessarily old enough to be considered ancient or indigenous, because they were really kind of produced inside of the Americas out of experiences in the Americas, so they're not particularly African. There's something more recent than that. But they're not quite new enough, or at least they don't appear to be new enough to be considered modern. So they're in this ambiguous space between something that looks kind of ancient, but that also has some characteristics of modern. And it just challenges a linear evolutionary model of how we think about religions from kind of indigenous to other forms. And inside of the interests in African diaspora religions, a lot of concern is shared among about how African they are, right? And they're kind of looking for a quality test of how ancient is it, or how modern or new or revised is it? And this is done through, if you look into this area, you'll encounter words like retentions and syncretisms. Retentions referring to what kind of ideas can be traced specifically back to different parts of Africa, and they were retained in this new space, right? Which is just the idea that they took this thing and then reproduced it in their homeland. That, in fact, is very difficult, if not impossible to do, because among the African descendants, they did not have the social freedom to create structures, right? Most of what they're producing is despite a lot of limitations placed on them. So retaining they weren't able to just retain and reproduce like some other places that had more institutional control. And then syncretism is a concept that refers to kind of blending of indigenous or African traditions, and usually Christianity, usually aspects of the Catholic Church. We'll see some examples of this in a moment, but it is a real interest in kind of bringing African cultural meanings into Christianity, into Catholicism. But again, this concern with like, how African are they, or how new are they? And so it can be situated within kind of a glass half full or half empty kind of approach for like how African these things are. And it reminds me of a statement from a longtime Colorado resident and Seminole scholar, Vincent Harding, who was commenting on the glass half full or half empty analogy and its association with optimism or pessimism, right? As these kind of like, what's your view, what's your take on the glass? Is it half full or half empty? And he advocated for the fact that there's a very concrete way to figure out if the glass is half full or half empty. Look to the history of the glass. Right? Did it start out empty and it's been slowly filling up with these things? Then you know for sure. Did it start off full and it's been slowly leaking or losing things? Then you know for sure. It doesn't need to be kind of a generic, general approach like optimism or pessimism. So we can apply that same thing to these traditions that are emerging in the Americas. So this map shows some of the transportation of Africans into the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade, to give a sense of the volume, some of the geography that Africans came from, and the bigger concentrations of where they were shipped in the process of the slave trade. And so you can see some very heavy lines from West Central Africa, and from West Africa there, and flowing into places throughout Brazil, Northern South America, and particularly the Caribbean, Cuba, Haiti, Jamaica, those kind of places. And you can see some tiny, thin little arrows going to the United States. And those are the foundation for the Black community in the United States, right? But you can see the comparison for the communities that are in other locations throughout the Americas. And that's some of the significance for studying African diaspora as opposed to African descendants in one country or another, because there's such a wide dispersal and much can get missed with a national lens. One of the conditions shared here is slavery. So this is going back to some older times and this active trade in enslaved Africans. This was bringing a lot of diverse people together from different parts of the continent, as we saw, that also had different languages. And so it was very difficult to communicate, for them to communicate with each other, even if they were experiencing similar conditions, right? And so they have to overcome not just being displaced from their home, but also the communication barrier and figuring that out. As they come into the Americas, they're facing this new experience coming from a place of being human to then coming to a place of being property, of being chattel. And this is the greatest difficulty because they are excluded from everything because they're not really considered people. They experience a kind of social death that excludes them from participating in the legitimate institutions of the society, the civil society, the government, the politics, the businesses, whatever the avenues that the society has created, they are excluded from those spaces. And that exclusion is enforced with physical violence, right, that we may be familiar with from some of the movies, but also symbolic violence. And the symbolic violence would be things like assigning a reputation to anything that looks traditional or indigenous or cultural, assigning a heavy negative value to that. Often, early times, it was associated with devil stuff, with evil, with demonic worship, with all of those kinds of things. In later times, it was associated with outmoded things, outdated, primitive was a favorite term for a while. Right, but these are all forms of symbolic violence that are relegating them and their cultural productions to this peripheral space, to this irrelevant space. This kind of exclusion became associated with race, and in so doing, it becomes associated with like birth. So there's very little avenues for mobility or freedoms inside of things because your status is assigned at birth, and then you're just excluded throughout life. And so this pushes the socio-cultural productions, what people are doing to make sense of the world, to create and share value of themselves with themselves. It makes it a very difficult process. It makes it by necessity an informal process, because they're not, all of those formal places are inaccessible. And by and large, it makes it a hidden process. So these things are not widely shared, publicized, because they're being attacked so rigorously. And finally, in addition to the exclusion, the social death, the integration with race, the different forms of violence, these Africans are also trying to produce things in conditions of deep trauma, post-trauma, with this concept of ma'afa, a major event that induces a tremendous suffering, upheaval, or trauma amongst a population. And for African descendants, that initial trauma was the Middle Passage, right? That uprooting from wherever they were in Africa, having this horrendous experience on the ships, and then being transplanted to a brand new place that was unfamiliar, right? And that produces, those trips were months and months long. and under horrible conditions. And so that produced a trauma that they're also having to deal with. And when we look at a lot of African diaspora religions, pieces of that middle passage tend to be inside of it, addressing it, redressing it, making sense out of that trauma that was perpetuated. So all of this goes to show that forging religion in diaspora is hard work. It's not a matter of just remembering things from the homeland and reproducing them. This is up against tremendous odds to produce some cohesion and coherence. So getting into Cuba, this is one of the earliest colonial sites of the Spanish Empire as it was expanding. Cuba became, after the Haitian Revolution, the world's #1 sugar producer. And that demanded a lot of enslaved labor to meet the demand of the world in sugar. And so that brought a lot more Africans there and a big surge in the 1800s or the early 1800s. And we can see some of the concentrations of places in Africa on the right there that were being taken to Cuba, right? Again, different languages, different geographies, and all of these people are getting mixed up in a new place. So for the communities in Cuba, they're going through a process of ethnogenesis, which is kind of a fancy word for trying to work out some kind of ethnic identity, some kind of identity that can be shared amongst themselves. And so it is not a matter of like old identities from the continent being reproduced, but a matter of producing meaningful identities in this new place that may or may not have relationships to the previous homelands. This process was slow, fragmented, construction of ethnic groups, of cultural groups, of religious groups. Up there is a picture of some sugar cane. That was one of the conditions that a lot of folks shared there in Cuba. And down on the right, there's a picture of a guy named Adechina, who's remembered as one of the originators of a tradition in Cuba called Ifa, that he had particular expertise in, and really helped to establish it in a structural way in Cuba, and is remembered fondly for that. The construction, the production of these cultural religious ideas needed space, right? And we talked about how the Africans don't have a lot of control over their spaces. They're being assigned, they're being worked in different ways, and so you really need some kind of autonomous or even semi-autonomous space to produce something authentic with each other. And so in Cuba, there's three big sites, three big spaces that were really important to cultural production there. The Baracones, the Palenques, and the Cabildos and Naciones. So Baracones are slave barracks. Down in the bottom right is a remnants of one of these. These are just the housing for enslaved labor. And then in the nighttime, in the off-work time, they can share in these crowded barrack-like living conditions. The Cabildos and the Nations are essentially fraternities or mutual aid societies that were legal in Cuba for a long time, and that also contributed to allowing them to kind of form together in groups that made sense, and then kind of figure things out in a more direct and meaningful way over time. These kind of mutual aid societies were illegal in the United States for a number of years, probably inspired by them being legal in the Spanish Empire, because they became associated with revolts and attempted revolts. And then Palenques is a really cool space. This is the space where Africans that had liberated themselves from slavery, they had escaped that scenario in some way, and usually escaped to the mountains, and formed communities in the mountains that were kind of hidden away and apart from the colonial structure. Right? And this was the space that had the most freedom, the most radical freedom, because not only could they come together and figure things out, but they're not under colonial structures. They can do so completely apart from all of the conditions of society that made things so difficult inside the colonies. And so we get several traditions that come out of a Palenque line. And bottom left there has a map of some of the Palenques in eastern Cuba to get a sense of the volume of these spaces. So out of these conditions, a number of traditions emerged in Cuba. These are a few of them. There are a lot of Africa-inspired religious traditions that developed on the island. I want to spend a few moments talking about a couple of them, and then some common characteristics among them. So these two are the Reglas de Conga, or Palomonte, and Regla de Ocha y Fa. So Regla de Ocha y Fa, also called Santeria in a lot of writings. They come out of that mutual aid tradition where people were coming together in this fraternal environment. They developed a ritual language that has very close associations with contemporary Yoruba speech. How many people have heard of Yoruba? As all right, yeah. So in Cuba, they don't call it Yoruba, they call it Lukumi. And Lukumi is a ethnic phrase that actually predates Yoruba. Yoruba came out of colonial endeavors that happened a couple centuries after this point of Lukumi being created as an ethnic identity for these folks. So we can see the timelines of these things get weird for how we understand things normally. So this Lukumi ritual language, and they, in this tradition, work with Orisha, which are these spirit forces tied to different aspects of nature or different aspects of life, and they're considered royalty. And so a lot of their traditions, a lot of the ritual objects that they use, a lot of the customs are all around celebrating this African royalty forms of deities that have avatars in different areas. We can see in this picture in the top, on the right-hand side, on the bottom there is the Orisha Shango, who's associated with thunder and lightning, is considered a warrior spirit. Also associated with the bata drums, which is an important aspect of cultural life there. And so we can see the drum on top of his head, him standing there, some lightning bolts, and then some of the avatars, some of the ways that they're represented in everyday life through the turtles. And Shango's having the turtles as one of those avatars. There's also a divination side to this tradition that tries to situate things within past, present, and future, and it's generally oriented to helping people maintain a balanced life. And these are some pictures of people dancing in or as different orishas. This is a part of the divination aspect of the tradition that utilizes combinations of, there's different ways to produce combinations of with these seeds, and through the combinations they'll correspond to aspects of their oral text, and that will give them insight into how these meanings apply to different moments. And so we can see some brief pictures of some of those combinations being used, and in the top right there, a consultation where this is being done in real time. Another tradition is Palomonte, or the Reglas de Conga, that also comes out of the cabildos, the mutual aid fraternal organizations. It has a ritual language that has been traced back to the West Central Africa, and specifically Kikongo, but Bakongo is kind of a broader linguistic group. And this tradition really focuses on the world of nature, the untamed aspects of nature, and has ritual objects that draw a lot of inspiration from iron and heavy metals, and has its own scripting tradition, so its own kind of writing system. It works with spirits called Mpongo, as well as muertos, which are kind of like ancestral figures from the island. And its emphasis is also about a balanced life, but more particularly about affecting change, channeling energy to affect real life things. And we can see some of the iron work that's involved there and its kind of relationship to those slavery days where iron materials were a big deal, were the core of a lot of the labor. But in addition to just like the tool implements and labor, this cultural community came from a place in West Central Africa that had pioneered steel, that had pioneered metallurgy in a way that it was deeply embedded in their cultural customs and their cultural traditions and in their sense of spirituality. So they have that kind of a cultural background that they're bringing to this, and we can see these worlds kind of merging. So now looking at a few shared characteristics amongst these traditions, we can see a lot of evidence of cross-cultural encounters, right, and exchanges in information. So these are adaptations and expansions in the symbolic universe. Symbolic universe being like the array of symbols that we're drawing on to make meaning about things. So we can see some expansions of those, utilizing things that are around and then kind of reassigning different meanings to them. And this raises the issue of the idea of syncretism, which is like a blending of these things, versus the idea of veneering or appropriation, like appropriating that symbol and then using it for your own kind of meaning. And so in one example, we can look on the right to this small figurine of Saint Francis, who in the regular day Ocha tradition is this saint figure is associated with or synonymous with the Orisha Orula. And Orula is the Orisha of the past, present, and future, and is the one particularly around divination. So you would ask, well, how did that association kind of get made? How did it link where Orula and St. Francis are so closely associated, where they have beads significant to Orula around St. Francis's neck there? Well, there was a story that St. Francis had witnessed Christ's crucifixion in a vision. And so he had, St. Francis demonstrated an ability to see into the future. And so they associate, so then it would make sense that the spirit around seeing into the future becomes associated with this saint. And in that way, there's a space for this spirit, even in the legitimate area, which was Catholicism, right? And in many ways, they were able to maintain a lot of their traditional knowledge by associating it with these legitimate spaces around, like the saints, that help preserve these ideas over time. Another example in this Palo altar space, on the bottom left there, we can see the big metal instruments that they're using, and then it's a little hard to see, but there's a crucifix on the bottom left there. And the crucifix is not particularly used as a reference to Christ and his life, but as a model of their sense of the universe and of the world, where it has, this crossed line where there's the land of the living and the land of the dead, and then on the other side, land of Africa and this new space. And so that it has more cosmological significance for how they conceptualize space in the world that's being brought in with these available symbols, with the crucifix being one. So you can see some complex work being done with these symbols and meanings. And then we have myths and rituals that are a part of these traditions. So myths comprise a lot of orienting stories that help people explain their own selves, help explain ideas within community. The stories are sometimes historical narratives, sometimes they're set in Cuba, sometimes they're set in Africa. Sometimes they're set with slavery or not slavery. But there's a whole body of stories that are shared and circulating amongst communities as they gather for ceremonies and different things. And in fact, if you're ever interested in who are these Orisha, you can find a number of books that will identify, all right, this is the Orisha of X, Y, and Z. It has these characteristics, it has these colors, and it gives a sense of almost these Orisha can be identified through playing cards, just here's the qualities and things. But in fact, the Orishas come to be known through the stories shared about him, through the mythology. And so it has this fundamental importance to awareness inside of the tradition. And then there are a number of rituals. And these rituals are the spaces to perform as well as personally embody the values that are central to the traditions. All right, this is the space to live out these experiences, to bring them into your body and share amongst each other. Rituals can be done to petition spiritual powers, to pray for things, as well as to direct spiritual powers, to try to affect change in different ways, and are a part of remembering with a memory to ancestors, to Africa, to different ancestors in the land, as well as remembering, which is bringing the community together and strengthening them in a new way, like members of a community. Rituals often entail vibrant dance, very active music, a lot of it rhythm heavy and rhythm focused, certain motions and gestures that are being made, sacred objects with particular kinds of powers, as well as language, right, are part of the ritual celebrations here. And inside of these rituals, these embodiment of values and things, we can see them drawing on different symbols. And those symbols can be historical or related to cultural awareness. So in Cuba, a lot of the religious traditions involve, a lot of these African-inspired religious traditions involve tobacco and rum. That is cigars and rum are sacred instruments that are used inside of the ritual practice, right? And then it's not coincidental that tobacco and sugar are the main crops, were the main crops of Cuba for a very long time, right? So there's this relationship with the space that's affecting the emergence of these traditions. As well as the history of slavery gets drawn on for symbolic means. And so this is one example of how the historical experience of slavery is brought into the religious sphere. So the picture here is from a ceremony that is in its final stage of consecrating a priest, essentially, a priesthood, a leader, a religious leader. And after a lot of training, as the person is ready to take that leadership role, they go through this final ritual, which is to demonstrate symbolically their commitment to the priesthood, their commitment to community and being a spiritual resource for people. And so what they have to do is with just shorts on, with bare back, they have to gather a number of seeds and plants, little greenery, as symbolic of the life that they're bringing and the life that they're contributing to. And then they have to protect those as they walk through a gauntlet of people that have sticks, essentially like whip-like sticks. And they are beating them as they go through, and they have to protect these seeds as they're just getting beat really bad and get to this little space here where they plant the seeds, right, in this symbolic way. And they have to do this multiple times, right? And so the idea is that they're drawing on that these values, that this spiritual work has to be done even through the brutalities of like slavery and that kind of extreme physical violence. It's that sacred and protected. All right, and then spirit possession is another quality of several of these traditions. That is the space where people become mediums for spirits, for ancestors, and then when that, and they talk about it through the verb montar, which is to mount. So the idea of spirit possession is a little misleading. Their understanding is that a spirit will mount somebody like you would a horse. And then they will kind of ride that body for a time, interact with people, talk to people, and then they'll dismount and they'll go on about their business. And so it creates a space inside of the traditions where people are not only engaging with each other in real time, but engaging very directly with ancestors, with historical time. And it produces kind of a different relationship to the past when this is such an active part of community activities. The people there definitely consider this to be real. Is generally considered normal. It's not particularly feared. It's not kind of like in the Exorcist movies or anything like that. This is something that's generally encouraged. And some academic scholarship in neuroscience has tried to make sense of these kind of scenarios through there's a number of ideas of different things it could be, but decentering is one of those ideas where somebody's primary identity gets decentered for a moment and another thing gains expression. Something like we think of aspiring to role models, and then they were like taking on those characteristics of the role model, but in a more neurological, special kind of way. Another attribute to the traditions is secrecy, right? And so this relates to some of those oppressive conditions that we talked about. All of these traditions in Cuba have a history of persecution, sometimes more extreme than others, but they have not been accepted or celebrated or anything like that. So there is an air of secrecy around these practices because they can be persecuted, because they can be misrepresented with some of that symbolic violence. But then there's also an aspect of the secrecy that adds some power to it, right? Where the knowledge isn't just available for all, but it's conditional. You have to kind of prove yourself, demonstrate yourself reliable, worthy, living, adhering to the values before you can access some of the knowledge. And so inside of those attributes with secrecy, there's a popular symbol in Cuba. We can see it on the bottom left there. It's an eyeball with the tongue coming out and a sword going through the tongue. And so the saying that goes with this image is that not everything that the eye sees should be spoken by the mouth. Right? In other words, you don't need to talk about everything you see here. And this is a building with that image painted on it as a mural where a lot of ritual activities happen in this space. Right? So people are invited, but this isn't open conversation about everything that happens here. And then these traditions facilitate mutual support networks where these communities are assisting each other, they're helping each other, they're sharing resources. A lot of this Ritual work entails a lot of resources and is very difficult to pull off access to those things alone. And so there is a really supportive network of groups and people there, as well as leaders. These networks can be multi-religious, so they're not just within one tradition or another, but they can involve several different traditions. And there is a strong emphasis within that broader community around accountability and opportunities. Opportunities where some people may exhibit behaviors or characteristics that would really thrive in this space that they're not necessarily a part of. And so the network will kind of push them to a space where their inclinations can be most heightened and enhanced. So that kind of opportunity shared. But then also accountability. If people start acting out of the norms of this religious community, they can be held accountable by people from within the broader network. And I saw one example of that with a person in Palo, a leader in Palo, who had been identified as kind of like, he seemed to be slipping into drugs. He was acting irreverent, he was acting disrespectful, he wasn't representing the tradition with respect in public spaces. And word got back to the leader that was kind of over him about this behavior. And so he set an appointment to essentially, and kind of an intervention, but to reconsecrate his leadership in his objects. And so this guy came to this scheduled event, and he came like 2 hours late. He was the disrespect was continuing. And so everybody was waiting around. And he finally got there, clearly didn't want to be there. And then they started waiting for, in this instance, it was a spirit to descend, to mount the body of the leader and then consecrate these things. They did the work, but the spirit never descended. And the spirit made this guy wait 3 hours, right? And he was agitated, right? But he simply would not take the body until he wanted to. So he finally came. They started doing a kind of cleansing of this guy, and he was just acting real disrespectful. And so the spirit in the body of the leader did something which I had never seen before. In the face of this guy's disrespect, he stopped the ceremony he was doing. He reached into his pants, yanked out his drawers, showed them to his face. It was like, this filth has to end. Poof, threw it down. And that got that man's attention. And he got his priorities straight, and he was much more respectful throughout the rest of the ceremony. So their own particular ways of accountability, but within this supportive community. They didn't just kick him out, but they really worked to bring him back in. And then these traditions also respond to racism and experiences of racism because they are challenging historical narratives that have undervalued Africa or diminished the significance of slavery or diminished blackness in one way or another. Right? They're valuing those attributes rather than diminishing, helping to deal with some of the trauma of slavery and the ma'afa inside of their ritual practices. Right? It's relevant and related to their historical experiences in this space and ways to continue living in a strong way. And then orienting people to that ultimate significance without attributes of whiteness as the standard or the reference, right? Which is also an important thing. It is based on something else. And so finally, these traditions provide a sense of self, family, community, inside of the world, inside of the universe, and does so despite the many limitations placed on them in society, offering a source of power to share meaning and affect change. And the traditions are not African, but African-inspired. Right? They are drawing from parts of that reservoir of meaning. Neither ancient nor African. They are part and product of the globalized world that we're a part of. And in that way, these traditions, they may look and refer to things that seem really old, but they are as modern as nuclear physics. Right? They are part of the same world that produced all of these scientific meanings, all of these new innovations in other spaces. They just did so in a different area. And that is my presentation today.
Wonderful, Dr. Shanti. Thank you for being here. Marjorie and I had the opportunity and privilege of hearing him a couple years ago at the ILEF School of Theology. And that's why we wanted to have him here. So we're open right now to Q&A. Are there any questions for Dr. Shanti at all concerning what he was teaching? Yes, ma'am. Let me bring you the mic. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing today. I was wondering, within the Palenques, what were some of the different ways that you saw those communities operating, whether in religious terms or otherwise?
It's a little tough because they're like very much off the grid, so there are not a ton of records. There's some kind of oral histories that have been passed down, but some of the characteristics that we can see in the urban traditions are an integration of indigenous symbols. So a lot of the multiple traditions will incorporate available indigenous symbols, like a little icon of an Indian with a headdress, right, and the feathers, or feathers as symbolic of that. And in some instances, some of the herbs and roots that are associated with indigenous life. Because the Palenques were oftentimes spaces that indigenous communities had carved out, that then Africans that escaped slavery joined. And so there was a really collaborative kind of space in that respect. So that's one element that was passed on and shared. Some of the linguistic heritage comes out of Palenques. It just is a different set of terminology and vocabulary than what came out of the cabildos and like the mutual aid associations that were in more urban spaces. And so there's kind of, it also has more indigenous words that were a part of that. And then there is for one of the traditions that kind of traces its roots to Palenque specifically, they have, it's less formalized. It's more, or maybe less formalized is bad to say. It's more improvisational in its structure, in its expression. It's a structure of improvisation that relates to a type of spirit that one would encounter rather than one would invoke. And so it relates to a time where people that had formed a relationship with a certain spirit would come to the foreground, rather than being trained inside of this universe of spirits that we can address and come to know. Yeah.
Okay, we got Jerome over here.
I was curious, with all your studies, how has it impacted your own perspective, your own personal journey? Mm-hmm. Particularly in terms of your identity and purpose in life?
Oh, that's a big one. Well, my personal journey was largely informed by indigenous communities to the U.S. And so that was kind of my home base. And what really struck me in encountering these traditions and encountering these people were the similarities. And yeah, some similarities like stronger than others, but it just brought my attention to like, these are very disparate communities, very separated, that don't have a lot of overlap, but they are sharing some very core ideas and even core symbols that one wouldn't necessarily think go together. And so that really attracted me initially early on as a personal kind of connection. But for sure, these traditions were forged in very difficult circumstances that remain relevant today. And so I personally draw a lot of meaning from them, particularly as it relates to like navigating some patterns of behavior that we have now, some structures of things that are not conducive to human survival. And so that's another area that resonates with me really well.
So, Dr. Shanti, you and I were speaking earlier about the different types of anthropology, because you're an anthropologist. Mm-hmm. So we talked about there's cultural anthropology, which was his major. Mm-hmm. We talked about medical anthropology and linguistic anthropology. And then what was your response when I mentioned those three?
Oh, for the new one that I was talking about?
The new one.
Yeah, the new one was anthropology of food, which is...
Can you say a few words about that?
It was just an emerging subdivision inside of the realm of cultural anthropology that looks at food ways, the cultural significance of food in the cultivation, in the execution. It can relate to things like predilection for certain foundational parts of the diet, like certain roots or sweet potatoes or yams and things, and how those get translated in different spaces and different areas. And it can relate to things like patterns of employment within Chinese immigrant restaurants, where they tend to hire inside of their family and bring their children into the service of the restaurant. Right? There's cultural patterns that emerge in these communities around food. And I just took food for granted so much that, seeing anthropology of food really broadened my sense of how absolutely fundamental food is to human existence, to cultural production. We tend to think in terms of economic stuff so much, but food undergirds economies, and so I like that area.
So this is a good dissertation for you to do in food anthropology.
Thank you so much for this beautiful information that you provided for the community here. And I'm very thankful that I was able to come and attend today. Talking about food culture, this is how I saw my identity as an indigenous. And when I went to other indigenous communities, I saw things such as world foods and how and the mechanism that was used, or the ceremonies when it comes to food and culture, such as if a newborn was to pass, what foods will be provided for the community versus weddings. But also it's the culture within that. What do they wear? And a lot of it has to do with beads and so forth. But I just wanted to state that. Thank you.
Yeah. while we're on the subject of Cuba, while we're on the subject of food, and thinking about Cuba, I wanted to point to this picture here. So, if you don't know, Cuba's a bit of a controversial subject here in the U.S. They had a revolution in 1959 where they became officially a socialist state. Their government is tied to the Communist Party, and they actively support socialist aims, which include providing free healthcare to the country, free education throughout the country, and food stipends. They really provide most of the basic social services, and to achieve that, they keep a lot of the incomes pretty uniform, no matter what the job is, so that the country grows together rather than individually in spurts. So that is how they're kind of oriented. That has not endeared them to much of the Western world, and they face different difficulties trying to maintain those priorities despite despite much of the world. They experienced, in the fall of the Soviet Union, they experienced a really difficult time where they were very isolated. They didn't have a lot of trade partners. Resources were extremely low. They called this period the special period. It has many, many correlates to what they're beginning to experience right now. Now that this administration has removed Maduro from Venezuela, Venezuela being a big lifeline to a lot of their fuel needs in Cuba, they're starting to experience really profound power shortages, supply chain breakdowns, trade breakdowns, and so they're entering a new kind of special period. So on the subject of food, and during these extremely difficult times, this being another one that they're facing, this is one of the ways that Cubans come together to survive these circumstances. And so this is a picture from a window, but down on the street there, in the middle of the street, is a giant iron cauldron. And there's a fire built underneath it, so it's boiling the water. So in times of extreme scarcity, like they're getting to again now, they will put this giant cauldron in the middle of the street with the fire underneath, fill it with water, and then whatever scraps of food anybody from the whole neighborhood has, they all bring it out to the street and put it in this pot. So it becomes this big mixture of whatever anybody has. It's included here as kind of a metaphor for how the religious traditions developed and emerged. But this is a concrete foodway strategy that they have for managing scarcity, and was kind of a hallmark of a lot of the special period where they faced extreme difficulties. And essentially, out of this pot, everybody throughout the neighborhood would have cups like this, and they would just scoop a piece of this soup. And have that as meals to share throughout. And so that's just one of the interesting foodways that have developed out of the circumstances that they have found themselves in a way that also embodies their collective values.
Sounds like the mile-long table without the table. How many remember the mile-long table? Yes, we're going to have one this year, 150th anniversary of Colorado. Again, let's thank Dr. Shanti for coming and presenting us today with the African diaspora and how it has affected the world. Now, this might give you a little bit more understanding of African Americans in America. God bless you and thank you. And let me remember next week, Dr. Raymond Carr is coming from Duke University to talk to us about Bart, James Combs, the father of Black theology, and Thelonious Monk, the great jazz pianist. Please don't miss that. God bless you. Thank you so much.